Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Oh,
Good afternoon. I'm Damien
think
Wetzel,
so.
Director of the Aspen Institute's Arts Programs, and I want to welcome you to this lunchtime roundtable. Can you all hear me? Yes. Very good. Can we tune up? Can we have an A? Okay, just to say that we're going to get
I was going to say, I don't want to hurt
all
anybody's
together,
ears.
because this is meant to be a round table, and even though there isn't a round table, there isn't one in the other room either, frankly, it's a square table, but it's meant to be participatory, so after the initial conversation, we hope we'll have some words from all of you to join in this. It's my pleasure to welcome Jeff Chang as our featured speaker this afternoon. Jeff and I participated in Citizen University earlier this year, talking about arts and social change, but now he's on book tour and he's here talking about We Gon Be Alright, We Gon Be Alright, and he's going to correct me a few times.
No, I'll correct you.
You'll correct me. But we are incredibly privileged to have Jonathan Capehart moderating, Washington Post editorial board, frequent participator in Aspen Institute activities. I think notably this summer with Attorney General Loretta Lynch, ideas that timing is everything. And also on his podcast, which some of us have been enjoying, and I hope more and more will enjoy, Cape Up, a remarkable conversation I recently listened to with Darren Walker, the president of the Ford Foundation, on the subject of privilege. So I encourage all of you, if you haven't been listening to that, do begin. I'm going to just cede right now because I'm excited for this conversation. I can't wait for it to begin. Jonathan, please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you all for being here. And thank you for that plug for my new podcast, which you can find on iTunes and Google Play. But that is it for the plug of the podcast, because I want to talk about Jeff Chang's book. We Gon Be Alright is how you pronounce it. And I was just saying to Jeff earlier that I spend so much time reading newspapers that I don't have time to actually sit down with a book. And I picked this up on Friday or Saturday and plowed right through it because it is so interesting, so powerful. And I would pick up the conversation we were having in the other room, and that is when you read this book, the biggest chapter is on Ferguson, the chapter called Hands Up. Yeah. And you give a detailed look at the first few days of what happened after the shooting of Michael Brown, and it made me wonder, why isn't this a book solely about Ferguson?
Well, it began as an essay that I was going to do, I thought, as an introduction to the paperback edition of my last book, which is called Who We Be, a cultural history of race in post-civil rights America. And that book is sort of about looking at visual culture over the last 50 years, how we see race, and how that's changed and not changed over the last half century. And so I went to Ferguson a year after Michael Brown had been shot for the anniversary, as sort of a way to begin to understand all of these things that had happened over the last 2 years, and ended up coming back with this 50-page essay. So the short of it is that the publisher said, you can't do an introduction to a book that's going to be 50 pages. That's just like way too long. But it's a new book. And so go forth and do this in 3.5 months. And so it's the fastest book I've ever done. I took 20 years to do the first 2 books, and I took about 4 months to do this. But it became sort of a meditation for me on all of the questions that the movement for Black Lives has raised, I think, for all of us across the country. And specifically, the gap between the races on everything from premature death, right, and life expectancy, and extrajudicial killings, and policing and incarceration, but also wealth, income, health, all of these questions, and forcing us to think more existentially about not just these questions of gaps and death, but really life. What does life mean? How do we live? How do we live the best, and how do we live together? Mm-hmm.
Now, leading up to the chapter on Hands Up, I mean, once I got to that chapter, I understood the chapters that preceded it. You set up a lot of information so that when you do get to Ferguson, when you do get into the details of what happened that afternoon, that Saturday afternoon, August 2014. Yeah, August 2014.
August 9th.
That you have context. One of the chapters is Vanilla Cities and their chocolate suburbs. Another one, where is it? Is diversity for white people. Can you really quickly go through and give the key points leading up to that chapter, so that for even folks who are sitting here who even have a cursory knowledge
Sure.
of Ferguson have a better idea of what happened?
So I begin by talking about the sort of cycle of crisis that we seem to be going through around questions of race during this post-civil rights era. So I start with 1965 and talk about how, this is the peak really of the civil rights movement and the national consensus around racial justice. The last national consensus around racial justice and cultural equity, that's the last time the nation agrees that we should be putting a lot of attention on this and doing a lot of work around it. And so legislation is pushed through Congress during those years, 64, 65, and a whole bunch of judicial decisions and sort of protocols follow the sort of infrastructure of laws, of decrees that are moving us now towards equality. Well, what happens after crisis is we usually have sort of a reaction to that, right? In 65, the reaction was to pass these laws. And then there's a backlash that sets in. And in some ways, the backlash lasted for long decades. And so we arrive at, for what was me, I think, in my generation, a critical moment in 1991 and 1992. And the Los Angeles riots sort of crystallized, I think, this moment where we have to look back and say, wow, we had crisis, we had reaction, we had backlash, we had complacency, and then we were back in crisis. So that's sort of the first thing. And then you move from 1992 to 2014, to 2013 first, right? With George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin. And then 2014 with Michael Brown, and on through now with the Movement for Black Lives. So we're in this cycle of crisis. And it seems like the language that we use, specifically the word diversity, doesn't help us to really understand what's going on anymore. And so what we've seen really is the dismantling, the reversal of a lot of the infrastructure that was created to move us towards equity and justice. That's been sort of kind of invisible. Visibly, we see in the media rainbow images of this country, right? And I was part of that. I spent a lot of time working in hip hop, and I still kind of consider myself a member of the hip hop generation. And yet there's this gap between what we see, this picture of diversity, and what's really happened, which is all of these indices showing resegregation happening. And so I wanted to kind of get at that last part, the resegregation piece in this book.
And with Vanilla, what was it, Vanilla Cities, Chocolate Suburbs.
It's a reversal of George Clinton, Chocolate City and
right.
Vanilla Suburbs, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the things we know as a result of the Justice Department's report, one of the two reports on the Ferguson Police Department,
right.
is, I think it was the first time that many Americans saw in black and white, no pun intended, just how much that town was still in like 1950s, where African Americans, there was one standard for African Americans and another for everyone else. That they bore the brunt of a lot of sort of power from the government exacted over their lives. But it's not just in Ferguson.
No, it's all across the country. And so in that particular chapter, Vanilla Cities and their Chocolate Suburbs, I actually start where I live, which is in the San Francisco Bay Area, where the big issue for the last 2-3 decades has been gentrification. And really, the reality of that has been the sort of huge decline of the black population in the Bay Area. And what we've seen, in San Francisco, I should say, right? And what we've seen is that folks have had to move further and further out, and that the gap in median household wealth is about 3 times. You're talking about a white household income being more than $100,000, and for a black household in San Francisco, it's less than 30 now. And folks have been forced to move to Oakland. Oakland is now the #5 rental market behind Washington, D.C., which for those of us who have lived in the East Bay forever, it feels crazy. And people have been forced to move even further out to Antioch, to Oakley, to Tracy, to Sacramento. The reason I actually saw this was because I'm a hip hop fan. And so in the early 2000s, you'd hear these records from cars blasting in the street, and you'd be like, that's a great record, where's it coming from? And you'd find out that the producer lived in Fairfield, practically near Sacramento. And so it made me start thinking a lot more about the geography of race and what's happened. And so gentrification feels like too small a word these days. It centers gentry, right? It centers the wealth that's moving into the cities, and it disappears people who are displaced. But people have to move to somewhere, and so they move to suburbs with names like Stanford, Florida, and Ferguson, Missouri.
Well, I mean, that gets to, you see me flipping through this book because I have it completely underlined with all sorts of information that Jeff has in it. But on this question of gentrification, you asked a question that, quite honestly, I had not even considered. And that is, gentrification has no room for the question, where did the displaced go? Instead, the displaced join the disappeared. And it's true. I mean, we talk about gentrification, and there might be some conversation about, oh, people are being pushed out. But then the next question is not pushed out where?
Right. People still have to live, and they have to live somewhere. And I think that's, in some ways, the story of what's happened in St. Louis City and St. Louis County. So what we see is the desegregation order comes down in the late 60s. And so now there's an opening for folks who have been concentrated in these neighborhoods in the city, right, north of the Del Mar Divide, what they call the Del Mar Divide, to now move into the suburbs. And so they move into many North County suburbs. And what we see is, for a minute, integrated neighborhoods, integrated cities. But then the tipping point happens at some point, and it moves towards becoming a predominantly impoverished neighborhood. And then the sort of city government, municipal government, remakes itself to be sort of a punitive machine that creates debtors' prisons in order to fund its own budget. And that's essentially what the DOJ report on the Ferguson police pointed out to us.
In terms of gentrification, is there a community that actually gets it right? Where people are moving back into cities, but the people who have been there, who've been the lifeblood of the community, aren't pushed out, that there is a coexistence? Because you have a couple of examples in here of people's voices literally being shut down. So you have, I think it's like a drum circle that had been performing for years in a park in Oakland, and then it stopped because of a noise complaint.
Yeah. So I just mentioned that Oakland is now the 5th highest rental market in the country. It's real estate folks are flocking to Oakland in order to participate in the rental boom there because of San Francisco, because of Silicon Valley. What we've seen over the last year in particular has been literally noise complaints on the rise. And so in West Oakland, folks in churches practice on Wednesday night or Thursday night for Sunday morning, right? And suddenly new neighbors who are in the areas are calling the police on the church choirs in West Oakland. At Lake Merritt, where there's been an African drumming circle, and not like sort of a drumming circle like we could talk about, but an actual drumming circle. Yeah, right? Not a Santa Cruz drumming circle, but an Oakland drumming circle. And so this drumming circle has been going on for years and years and years, and there's a strong sort of history of Afro-diasporic culture in the area. Down on 12th Street, there's a center there called the Malunga Cascalar Center. Anyway, there's drumming circles, and suddenly folks want to walk their dogs on Sunday and don't want to hear drumming, and so they call the cops on the drumming circles. And there's been this ongoing sort of thing that's been happening in Lake Merritt between these different publics that are sort of competing, if you will, for this space. And this I think is a perfect example of how the cities have changed. I'm not a policy expert, and I'm not an urbanist per se. By training, I work in culture, I work in the arts. I'm interested in the urban stuff because frankly of hip hop. I grew up on hip hop. I grew up in the suburbs of Honolulu and the countryside of Oahu. But I am very interested in how these things change, and I can't really I can point to many more examples of where things have gone awry or where things are going awry than places where things are going well. Mm-hmm. I was on the air the other day with Minnesota Public Radio, and a gentleman by the name of Myron Orfield, I just want to give you this last story here, who's been an expert on this, called in and said that Minneapolis and St. Paul in the 80s, through the end of the 80s, was a model city for thinking about integration. And then at some point in the 90s, it switched. And now we spent literally about 40 minutes with people calling in saying, my neighborhood is segregated and here's why. So I emailed Myron afterwards and I said, Myron, this is a really weird question, but I just want to kind of get at something here. I was doing the math, and you said that 60s, 70s, 80s, Minneapolis and St. Paul were a model for integration. And it occurred to me that in around 1978 or 1979, there was a 17-year-old guitarist named Prince Rogers Nelson who came out of Minneapolis and first turned me on to the whole music scene in Minneapolis. He said, actually, I went to junior high school with him. So Myron is now an expert on segregation issues, and Prince left us this legacy that thinks about how American culture can be inclusive and opening. And I think that that's actually, in a weird way, the cultural stakes of what's happening right now.
So how on earth does a kid who grew up in Hawaii, and you said the countryside or rural outside of
it was in the suburbs, but my grandparents lived on the windward side, what they call countryside. Yeah. So
how on earth do you get into hip hop?
Through culture. It's really through culture.
What was it about hip hop that attracted you, that drew you?
Kids doing their thing, kids with their language and their walk and their talk, and kids of color, because at that time in the media, even in Hawaii, it was largely about the white suburbs. Popular culture was literally largely about the white suburbs. That was the ideal life. The Brady Bunch and all these other kinds of things, right? 8 is enough, all of that, right? And so this was like, wow, this is something that I can relate to. And I, just like a whole bunch of other kids, heard Rapper's Delight and just wanted to learn all the lyrics to it, in our school. No, I'm not going to try to rap it. Is that what you're going to ask?
Yeah, uh-huh.
No.
Come on, just say you could.
No, I'm not. I'm not a rapper. I'm a DJ, actually, yeah.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, I've been a DJ, yeah.
Wait a minute. So I am a DJ, then I've been a DJ.
I am a DJ. I DJ for myself. I don't DJ publicly that much.
Why is it that every DJ I meet says, I DJ for myself, I don't DJ?
I really literally used to DJ. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
and for folks who are hip-hop folks in the audience, you'll get the sort of, I'm the DJ, he's the rapper reference. Anyway. Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
DJ Jazzy Jeff.
DJ Jazzy Jeff.
And the Fresh Prince.
And Fresh Prince, who now is better known as Will Smith. Yeah.
I forgot about that. But yes, that is true. He has so gone mainstream.
Yes, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air.
So in your book, you get into a lot of this in the chapter, the in-betweens.
Yes.
And you write about yourself in the second person, which took me a while to get, because after all of these facts and figures and very blunt in your face, suddenly you're asking it took me a while to realize you were asking questions of yourself, answering your own questions, and talking about yourself from this remove. Why did you write like that?
Why did I write like that? Well, first of all, I had to do the essay because I couldn't write a book that was about the questions that the movement for Black Lives has made all of us ask of ourselves, and not ask that question of myself, what that means for me as somebody who is Chinese and Native Hawaiian of descent. And so, there was a point when I was in this process where the editor said, I need more you in this book.
Don't you hate it when the editor says that? I need more you. Like like what? How much more do you want?
Yeah, because the I is sort of implied, right, through the whole thing. But she's like, I really need more you. And I've had a hard time. I've never written publicly in the first person. It's just a hard time. I just have a hard time doing it. And so I started experimenting with the second person. And I was actually inspired by Claudia Rankine's Citizen. And she does something that's very interesting in Citizen, where she writes in the second person, and it forces you as a reader to either say, I identify with what, and she's writing about microaggressions, right? These little moments during which you're made brutally aware of your particular racial position in the sort of social hierarchy. And you have to either say to yourself, I identify with that, or I don't identify with that at all. And if you don't identify, then you have to find sort of a well of empathy to be able to make that leap, to understand the you. And so the second person forces that. And I thought that was very interesting. I did it because I didn't want to write in first person. And it ended up being a pretty good type of thing, because I wanted to really interrogate myself. I wanted to get behind sort of my sort of political public types of opinions and get into the ambivalences that are there in the Asian American Pacific Islander experience of being in between black and white in the sort of American racial hierarchy.
And before you get to the in-betweenness of that chapter, you start out by talking about your childhood in Hawaii, how it wasn't until you came to do you call it the continent?
The continent.
Yes, here.
Right. Well, people call it there's a great poem, actually, that was written by a local guy in Hawaii that ended with the line, Hawaii's not the mainland. Like, I mean, America's not the mainland, Hawaii is, or something like that. I just really killed the beauty of his poem. But we used to call it the mainland, right? We used to call it the mainland. But like, Hawaii's the mainland for us. So
the mainland,
the continent, yeah.
So the mainland is the continent, and you write that when you were growing up, there were no distinctions. You had all these friends. It wasn't until you got to the continent, till you got to stateside,
I got to California,
that you started learning what it meant to be Asian American.
To be, yes, and to specifically be a minority. I come from a family that has been in the islands for 4 on my dad's side and probably 5 or 6 on my mom's side. Generations, that's right. And by now we've intermarried. So, Black, Puerto Rican, every Pacific Islander and Asian ethnicity you can imagine. White, a lot of Hapa cousins I have. So you take a picture of us and we literally look like a Benetton ad. It's it's crazy. It's sort of when Barack Obama was presenting his sort of extended family, we're like, yeah, I can totally relate to that. We could totally relate to that. And so that was sort of my experience. And coming to California, coming to Berkeley, and suddenly being called racist names, having sort of these hate incidents happen around me and to my friends. I was like, what's going on? It was very much of an adjustment that I kind of had to make. I just lost my train of thought on the in-betweenness. But you have a moment in this book. You had just spoken at an event, and it's over. And as people do, they come up and they talk to you. And this Asian American woman comes up to you, and you get into an altercation with her. Right.
And it sort of crystallizes everything that you've been talking about in that chapter, but also in this book. Please summarize that that incident.
Should I read it or no?
No, sure,
No.
read it.
Oh, yeah, okay.
No, because
Okay.
it's an interesting back and forth. I don't know if I would have the guts to do that to someone who came up to me.
Okay. So what happened was, this is an event about Fresh Off the Boat, which you all may know is a TV show featuring Eddie Wong and his Taiwanese American family. And so the question comes up about cultural appropriation. And I instead kind of, whatever, sort of judo it and jujitsu it into a sort of a...
Because you didn't want to talk about it.
Well, the appropriation question I think is a really important question, but I wanted to talk about Asian Americans' role in resegregating, the Bay Area. But I realized that I couldn't, that this was like not the place. Like we're talking about fresh off the boat. I could go really like deep into this, but it wasn't the right place to do it. And so I mentioned casually sort of, segregation and that kind of thing. And this woman comes up to me and I say, so it says, an older Chinese American woman comes up to talk to you, practically runs up on you and says she wants to ask what you meant by resegregation. She says that her husband is an activist, does great things for the community, and is a leader of the efforts to support Asian Americans in the public schools by getting rid of quotas for blacks and Latinos. You're horrified. You tell her you disagree with her husband, and she stares at you. You hear yourself telling her that you don't believe he's doing anything to help Asian Americans. I want to know what is wrong, she retorts, her eyes growing wide and her voice rising, with wanting to protect our people from discrimination. It's over. You want to walk away from her at this point. You want to walk away from being Asian American. You know her story just by hearing her Sunset District accent, by seeing the stress lines on her face. You recognize this anger. All those times they were taunted, beaten, humiliated in the schoolyard or the street. All those people in authority who made them feel subhuman. All those jobs or homes they never got because of the color of their skin. All those times they played by the rules only to see a white person get ahead. You can feel her rage. Or rather, you think you can feel her rage. Maybe in this moment you're not really Asian American. And now you should shut the F up and go home, but you can't. I just censored that. You tell her the days are
and
over.
it's censored in the book. He doesn't.
When Asian Americans should think only in terms of their self-interest. That Asian Americans ought to think about what it means to fight for justice and equity for all. You ask her quite loudly and quite rhetorically if she wants to defend a public school system in which the resources are allocated disproportionately to Asian Americans. Is that what she wants? Because if that's what she wants, that's not your idea of an equal and just society. You feel good. You know you're right. Of course you're right. Now she's shouting at you and people are staring. The crowd that has gathered looks at her with a bit of pity, not because they have any idea what the two of you have been arguing about, but because your provocations have made her emotional. That's when you finally walk away. But later when the night is over, you can't help but ask yourself, who is the real Asian American here?
I mean, again, because now you got to hear when Jeff reading it in the second person, you, as you were saying before, you're forced to sort of like hear the words and then try to empathize with what's going on. And for me, reading that section, that vignette, I found myself thinking, I don't know who's right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, should she be getting so upset? Well, why shouldn't she be getting upset? She thinks that she and her husband are doing the right things for their children and for their community. How it doesn't sound well. It doesn't. From that, you didn't bridge the divide. If you had to, if she were here, is she here? If she were here, if she were here today, is there anything you would say to her differently than you did in that moment?
A lot. I think I would do a lot. I think, I know how I feel about these kinds of questions. I was staunchly against the lawsuit to overturn the consent decree that desegregated this particular high school, Lowell High School. And if I had had more time and I wasn't so full of rage that night, I think that I would have tried to say, well, why do you think discriminating against other minorities should help Asian Americans? And I think I would have had a much different kind of a conversation. And I think that's the place of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, being in between in so many ways. We can choose to sit on the fence on a lot of these questions. We can choose to kind of opt out of these questions, but in many ways, that doesn't take us any closer to where we need to be for all of our kids. And so at the end of the day, my heart and my mind are settled very much on my on the position that I put out publicly and politically. But I think I had to approach it from the point of view of trying to understand.
Mm-hmm. I've had the book open to this particular section where you said, what does it mean to be in between? It means one can afford to sit on the fence, decide not to take a stand, to always reserve the privilege while the battle rages all around to disengage. And you don't think that Asian Americans or anyone should sit on the fence, should disengage, that people should join the fight, if you will, in terms of bridging the gaps in understanding?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's why I write, you know. I feel like I don't want to see, you know, 7 generations from now being in a situation in which color, class, and caste have congealed and converged in ways that are much more divided than they are now. Mm-hmm. And I feel that looking at the last 50 years of history in the U.S., that's what we've seen beginning to happen. And of course, the number that looms over all of this is 2042, right? Which is the year that it's supposed to really all go to hell, I guess.
Is that when we become a majority
minority, right? Yeah.
Country?
Yeah, and I think that, you know, you see a lot of folks pointing to that right now in the rhetoric that they use, you know, to gain office or that kind of thing, to gain power for themselves. So, so I write for that reason. I write towards 2042 and beyond, I guess.
So this book isn't just about. It's not just about the political. There's a huge cultural piece to this book. The cover of the book are these 2 hands, which the significance of this doesn't come into play until later in the book. Talk about these hands.
Yes, these are the hands of an activist in Ferguson. It's from a series of posters that Damon Davis, an artist in Ferguson, put together. Damon's an artist and an activist. He saw in the lead up to the announcement of the non-indictment that many of the folks who had been out in the streets were feeling very weary. They were feeling very down. They were very despairing. And he wanted to do something that would lift up the organizers and to sort of bring a little bit of light to the city in a way. And so, as everybody will remember, Governor Jay Nixon declared a state of emergency a week in advance of the announcement of the non-indictment. And so immediately, you know, plyboards went up on all the windows on West Florissant in Ferguson, the main business road. And so what Damon did with the help of a bunch of folks was to take pictures of the hands of white, black, young, old organizers, and with you know, their hands up like this against a white background to make these huge posters. And they went up and down West Florissant and asked the businesses if they could post these pictures, post these posters on these on these plywood boards, and they did. And that gave folks a little bit of a sense of, well, we can see ourselves represented. But also, too, if you kind of think of it as a whole, kind of this concert of folks, you know, like, you know, whatever, hip hop, right? Throw your hands in the air and wave them like you just don't care, right? Like, it doesn't necessarily mean surrender in this particular instance. It's a picture of the community as a whole that were up on these plywood boards. So it gave folks a little feeling of joy, a little bit of recognition in those hard days. I wanted to end the story by saying I was lucky enough to be at the National Museum for African American History and Culture this past weekend for the donor opening. And what I know is that Damon, after the riots occurred, went back to Ferguson Market, which is where Michael Brown, you know, took the cigarillos, right? And it's become a flashpoint. And there was one poster that was left on one piece of board, and he asked the owner for it. And he was able to get it, and he took it home, and the Smithsonian contacted him later. And so the last remaining original poster is now here in the new museum. And I don't know if they've exhibited it yet, but it's a really powerful piece of history.
No, I'll go look for it on Saturday. There's another art piece of artwork that you write about, and that is the coffin.
Yes.
That was covered in broken
Mirrors.
glass and mirrors. Talk about that and the reaction of the police.
And that piece is also in the Smithsonian as well, in the NMAHC. Actually, Angela Davis writes about it in the current issue of Smithsonian Magazine. But it was a piece where they fashioned a coffin and put mirrors on it, and then they broke the mirrors, and they carried this to the front of the line on one of the nights near the police department. And it was meant, I think, to evoke the state that we'll all be in if we don't actually try to figure out ways to bridge this. And the police who were standing on the line saw it, and many of them were visibly shaken. It was one of these moments in which there was this dialogue. And I think that in so many ways, so much of this election has been about this sort of monologue of fear, right? And here was a dialogue that had been opened up by a piece of art, that fears can be transformed, that they can be shared and transformed into a different kind of way of understanding things. And I think that that's what the coffin, which was put together by DeAndrea Nichols, as well as and she had a group of artists in St. Louis and Ferguson help her put it together. I think that that's what the coffin meant to symbolize.
I think, didn't you write in that section that as the coffin was brought up and the police officers looked at the mere power of being able to see themselves reflected back at them, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I think I'm wrong, that in some ways they saw their own humanity, and that they all just turned and walked away.
I don't know that they turned and walked away.
Yeah, there's another instance.
I don't know that they turned and walked away. But there is another instance in which that happens. And what I think I found so moving and powerful about what was happening in Ferguson was that there was an underlying spirituality to it. And the idea was, if the police and the state are going to continue to escalate the situation, that what we've got to try to do is to figure out ways to de-escalate and to take care of ourselves and to bring us back and to draw us back into understanding of ourselves as a community that's got to work these questions out. And I think that continues to be the language and the sort of consensus of the movement for Black Lives, is that we've got to de-escalate from the militarization, we've got to de-escalate from the prison industrial complex, we've got to de-escalate from these kinds of things that are separating us, and to try to find ways to center the most vulnerable communities in the discussions of what needs to happen moving forward next.
Among the many things I loved about this book was that this wasn't just sort of writing about the politics of what happened in Ferguson, but what's happening in the country, but it also talks about the role that the arts and artists play in this moment. But I have to ask you, because the way it's written here and the way you've said it several times here, out there in the rest of the world, we call it the Black Lives Matter movement. But you consistently call it the movement for Black lives. Clearly that's conscious. Why do you do that consciously?
The movement for Black Lives, I think, is an infrastructure of folks throughout the country who have been coming together, talking about these issues. And the movement for Black Lives are the folks who issued an agenda and a platform that they're offering for change. And so I say the movement for Black Lives Matter movement, I kind of use them interchangeably. I want to highlight and give and lift up and sort of give props to the movement for Black Lives, because they have been working very, diligently and democratically to be able to put together ideas that we can then bring into the public sphere, into the public policy space.
I'll turn it over to questions from the audience in a couple of minutes, but okay, I want to pick a bone with you. We talked about it. We talked about it earlier, but we have to.
Let's totally do it.
We have to put it out there. Yeah. So, and it's not the hands up. It's respectability politics. So, whenever I've written about Ferguson, Black Lives Matter movement, anything related to President Obama and what he has or hasn't done for the African American community, someone, more than someone, a whole lot of people will come back at me on Twitter talking about you're just operating with that brand of respectability politics. Define respectability politics, and what's wrong with that?
The way that I understand respectability politics is that it's sort of a way of thinking about politics that privileges a certain range of voices to the exclusion of many others. And so when Alicia Garza, one of the architects of the Black Lives Matter hashtag first, and now the Movement for Black Lives, began writing about this, the way that she described it was that the movement needs to be rethought and rebuilt in a way that allows for all of these marginalized voices within the Black community to be able to be raised up.
So when you say the movement, you're talking about the broadly defined civil rights movement.
Black queer voices, Black women's voices, Black trans voices, Black immigrant voices, Black undocumented voices, Black incarcerated voices. These are the voices who have not been part of the conversation. And respectability politics has become sort of a catchphrase for being able to talk about the way that power has been concentrated in the civil rights movement in the past. And so, I'm not necessarily certain how folks are using it in response to you at all. And I don't really want to get into all that. I can't speak for anybody but myself, right? And I think that what the Movement for Black Lives has done is to be able to say, let us center, let us bring forward these voices that have been marginalized.
And one last question before you throw it out to Q&A, and that is, and I will admit, I have not seen Lemonade.
You haven't?
I have not seen Lemonade
Jonathan.
yet.
Okay, so you got to take the afternoon off and do this.
Everyone was talking about it.
It's going to take a whole afternoon. It only takes an hour, but you're going to want to watch it over and over again.
And I was going to, when I got to that, I was like, damn, I should probably watch Lemonade before this event. And then you kept talking about songs and things like, this is going to be a lot of time. I don't have the time. So why is Lemonade such, for you, it was like a seminal moment, both in the culture, but also in our politics?
Yeah, so just to let everybody know, so the last essay is called Making Lemonade. And it came out just as I was wrapping the book up.
By Beyonce.
By Beyonce. And it's a visual album and it's an album. And the thing that was really exciting to me about that particular record, and what happens, I think, in the popular culture every once in a while, is something like some work of art kind of comes out that encapsulates the entire moment. And luckily, and weirdly enough for me in writing this book, Lemonade came out. And I cherish it so much because it speaks to the question of what kind of justice we need at this particular point. What kind of revolution we need at this particular point. So the first thing to say is that I think that cultural change always precedes political change. That you have to have the imagination for change before you can even begin to talk about policy. And that work takes sometimes a long time, sometimes it sort of crests all of a sudden out of a moment. It reaches an inflection point out of seemingly nowhere. But the culture has to move before we can even get to the politics of it, the policy of it. And Lemonade happened at a moment in dialogue with the Black Lives Matter movement as a way to be able to advance some of these ideas. It's about a love affair, right, in which her lover has cheated on her, right? And so much of the record is about like the fire and the anger and the rage, and then the despair, the depression, the sort of self, infliction of wounds that kind of happens out of this, but eventually reaching a note of grace at the end. And it parallels this notion that's in the Movement for Black Lives platform, which is transformational justice, which is not only do we have to figure out how to get justice for those who have been harmed, right? But how do you transform those who have done the harming as well, right? And to center and focus on those who have been harmed, right? That's where most of the work has to happen. But it's not about a bloody revolution. This is not a revolution in which one group displaces another group that's in power, right? There's got to be a way to bring those who have done the harming out of the center, but allow for their redemption as well, which is a crazy and a powerful, it's a very spiritual and religious concept, right, as well. And it seemed to all be there in Lemonade. So, I mean, there's a whole bunch of reasons to hail the Queen. I think that's one of them.
And when you mentioned the word grace, it
Yeah.
reminded me of the quote that you have from Carrie Mae Weems, the artist and MacArthur Foundation genius.
Yes.
That you go on and write, finding grace is an individual process that changes the social. It is about seeing each other in the world and seeing one's own place in the world anew. In that way, grace can counter the lies, refusals, and aggressions that drive us towards segregation. And we didn't even get to talk about the whole concept that you write about, resegregation. But among many things, this is one of the things that I underline because I thought it was a great sort of definition of what the word grace means. Jeff Chang, you've been terrific. I want to throw this out, but we're not done because I want to throw this out to questions from the audience. Please, my two admonitions. One, make sure they are questions and not statements, because I'll be forced to cut you off. I don't want to be rude, but you're forewarned. I will be rude. And make your questions as brief as possible so we can get as many people in as possible. And I will go to the first hand that went up in the back. And then I'll come to you.
What do you think of the Kaepernick protest and the support surrounding him?
I think it's been a really...
Support within the league.
Support within the league, right. I think it's been a really... The question came up the other day. We launched the book in Silicon Valley because I work at Stanford. And that's also where the 49ers play now. So it was on everybody's minds. And I think most of the questions had to do with why did he do it on 9/11? Why did he do it in this kind of a way? Blah, 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 blah. Don't you think that he should have done it in a more sort of appropriate kind of a way? And my thought was, well, if he had done it in an appropriate kind of way, quote unquote, we wouldn't be talking about it now. That protest is meant to be disruptive. It's meant to shake us out of our comfort zone, and that it's meant to be something that changes the way that we think about things, or at least forces that kind of a conversation. So I'm all for it. I think this is something that has been a long time in coming, and I think that the discussion hopefully will be able to continue over the coming months.
The question right here in the front. Hold on, there's a mic coming for you.
Thank you. Obviously, Ferguson's become the metaphor for the gap in inequality. I was aware of a film made in Ferguson, begun just before the Michael Brown shooting, focusing on a young black teenager who tells her story. It's a powerful film. It was apparently screened before a group of university officials and public officials. And it turns out that the film used subtitles, and half the people in the room were horrified, and the other half didn't even notice. And I wonder what your reaction would be to that.
Wow, subtitles?
Subtitles.
For African American vernacular English, the AAVE?
Yes.
Wow.
They felt they had to use it. That's how great the divide is, I think.
I think that you've said it all right there. Absolutely, yeah.
Woman in green?
Yeah, yes.
Your other side.
Hi, I'm Cynthia Schneider from Georgetown University. It's so great to hear you speak. I'm such a fan of your hip-hop writings.
Thank you.
My question is, have you tried to get policymakers or people in government to take your theory, your statement, which I agree with 100%, that culture is important, that culture precedes change, so culture is part of change. Have you gotten people to take this seriously? And
Hold on 1 second. I think I'm going to have to ask you to.
Okay, I'll start again, but I'll start quickly.
Great.
Have you? My question is, have you, and if you have, how have you gotten policymakers, government leaders to take your idea, which I agree with 100%, that culture is a really important part of change and culture leads change? I've been trying to make this point in foreign policy for many years, as you might have noticed, without any particular success. And I just, if you'll forgive me, Jonathan, I just noted in the discussion about Lemonade, you said, oh my God, I thought I should listen to this song, but then, oh my God, all these other songs, and I knew I didn't have time for that. Now, if he had said, you must read this article, or you must read this book of articles, I wonder if you'd have the same response. Maybe you would. I'm sorry.
No, I would, because it was late. It was like
Okay,
late.
okay.
That was a time issue. If it had been 3 p.m, I would have done it. But
Okay.
it was 10:30.
Okay, but I forgive me then. But I think it's a very common response. Oh, I don't have time to listen to the music or
Yeah.
talk to the artist. I have to do serious things, and that couldn't be serious.
Yeah.
So how have you succeeded with that?
So the question of sort of how is this translated into getting into folks who are working in policy and that kind of thing. So I think that there's been a shift actually over the last 5 years on this question, certainly in sort of the nonprofits type of world. Maybe not as much in academia. I think academia around the arts tends to actually lag behind even the nonprofits. But philanthropy and foundations have been taking this idea very seriously. Darren Walker is actually a huge champion of cultural shifts and cultural change, and he has made Elizabeth Alexander now the new person who's overseeing their culture program, which I think is just an amazing appointment
At the Ford Foundation.
At the Ford Foundation, and so what I think is that more things will come out of that in terms of academic research and in terms of different types of ways that we can think about things. I think that, honestly, a lot of this stuff is happening already in the parties, in the political parties. We are in a new stage of the culture wars, right? And I think that folks who are trying to assemble electoral majorities are thinking about these kinds of things all the time. Many folks used to call it communications, but I think that it extends far beyond that. And so some of the most interesting work is happening there in a weird way. But I also want to say that a lot of the interesting work is happening amongst folks who are actually energized by the Obama campaign to see literally how this one poster by Shepard Fairey, of Obama, right? This black and white man colorized into red, white, and blue with the word hope put underneath it, spawned literally a million other posters and other types of ephemera and memorabilia, but spawned all these other types of posters. That there was a sort of cultural kind of wave that came in 2007 and 2008. And many folks are working now with foundations, particularly the Nathan Cummings Foundation, to generate a lot of research around this particular question. So you can look up the Cummings Foundation. There's a bunch of other folks, Unbound Philanthropy, that have put together this thing called #PopJustice. There's a number of reports that have been put together around it. I was part of a group called the Culture Group. You can go to the website for the Culture Group, and there's a number of reports that have been put out there as well. And I think that we're just at the beginning of this.
You mentioned the hope poster, and I'd forgotten. Remember the Will.i.am?
Yes.
Yes,
yeah.
we can. That was
Yes, we can.
another
Yeah.
flashpoint cultural moment where that was zapped around. People were singing it. He was huge at that moment. But why don't we have that same sort of thing happening now? Or am I so deep in the weeds of this presidential campaign that I haven't seen it, where we've seen this election cycle's cultural version of the Hope poster, or Yes We Can, the Will.i.am musical
Music video, yeah. Well, that was spontaneous. It was not campaign spawned.
Right.
The campaign actually, at the beginning, distanced itself from a lot of that work, and I'm not really sure. I'm just not really familiar with what the campaigns are doing now around this type of question. If they've been seeding different types of artists to do different type of work. But I want to make a point too here that this is something that's incredibly contested. And so when Obama first came into office, I was part of a group of folks that came to the White House to talk about questions of culture. And we met with a number of different folks, and eventually what it became was this amazingly robust public program where they invited in a whole bunch of amazing artists to come and perform at the White House, but did not necessarily explore the dimensions of cultural change in a lot of respects. And that's because the right mobilized against the Obama administration. You'll remember there was an NEA fight that Breitbart.com kind of spawned, and then the Van Jones, I think, question. These are Yossi Sargent, who was at the NEA, and Van Jones were two of the folks who had come in wanting to do a lot of work around culture, and it quickly became this debate around propaganda. Is the federal government propagandizing against us? And so we're talking about culture while we're in the culture wars, right? And that's, I think, what makes everything very difficult and complicated.
A lot of hands. I'm going to get to all of you. Start with you here in the blue shirt, then you, then you, then you.
Michael Feldman, Create Equity. Can you go back to the second person approach you used in your book, where you have an idea that you're creating empathy by using the second person, and how can arts activity create that empathy and inform this debate around culture?
Sure. So in that particular use that Claudia Rankin was using around the second person, I think that if there was a gap that one experienced, one would have to figure out how to bridge it in order to be able to continue to move through the text in the same way that you were forced to go back to the beginning once you realized what the address was about and who was speaking. And I think that it's common that we've talked about the arts as spawning empathy, as being able to create empathy. There are limits to empathy. I want to say that too. That if we look at the question of empathy, how often does that translate into support for policy and that kind of a thing? It's not the same type of thing, right? You can enjoy hip hop and still be in favor of a lot of. Marco Rubio is a huge rap fan. Let me just say that. So he loves Tupac. Tupac is his hero. So there's a whole bunch of other things that need to kind of happen in between. But I think it's the minimum kind of consideration. Yeah, he'll say that. He said that publicly. There's a lot of stuff that needs to happen, but that's the sort of it's insufficient, but it's necessary. So yeah.
Question here.
I have a Ferguson question. I'm Michonne Boston. On my Facebook, I see an activist was killed in Ferguson, and it involved a burning car. I wonder if you have more information about that.
Yeah.
And also, how is, since I found out about it on social media, had I not been plugged in with certain kinds of friends who are looking at these things, how do we keep ourselves open to the channels of information so that we're expanding, but we also have the choice to hide things too?
Yeah.
Great question.
It's a great question. So on the first question, I don't. I know that many of my friends have been mourning his passing, and I know that there's been other situations, and there are investigations are happening. I'm following that as well, following that story as well. It's a very interesting and a larger question around the sort of notion of social media. How is it used? Does it become an echo chamber? Does it become something that closes us off or helps us to actually, connect, right? And I think that there's a broader debate that's been happening around the question of whether social media at all is useful in social movements. I think that the movement for Black Lives answered that question pretty significantly, that social media does have a key place, not just as a gathering place for information, right, but as a place to be able to organize, right, and that was sort of the thing that helped this movement to spread so quickly in so many kinds of ways. I think the larger question of where we bridge is a really, really important one. I'm still trying to figure that out. And it's also why I'm very interested in the culture, in these moments, such as Lemonade, where there's the possibility of this actually breaking through. Super Bowl performances, those kinds of things. There are still these moments that tend to leapfrog, the social media kinds of communities that we may create that may be gated in some ways as well. So thank you for the question.
The young fella there with the spiky hair. Ish. Spiky-ish.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. I wonder, just on a gut level, how hopeful are you, or maybe how does that fluctuate?
The title is what it is.
We Gon Be Alright.
And I think, if you look at the song, like 95% of the lyrics are about his struggle, right? And then he just pulls this line up, but we gonna be all right, And I think it's a beautiful thing, and I think that's why it's become an anthem for so many folks, right? For the Black Lives Matter movement, but also for so many other folks, for so many young folks. And so I gotta be hopeful. I have to be, I have to have a reason to get up in the morning. I have to be able to think that things might be better for my kids and their friends, and then for their kids and their friends. And so that's why, I keep on doing this. And I know it sounds really corny, but that's who I am. There's a real corny part of me.
Question here.
Hi, I'm Mac Odell. I was in the first Peace Corps group to go overseas in '62. And I was going to ask this question to you about, are we going to be all right? Because we're not sure. So I have to shift. I have a two-part question. I have to shift it to Jonathan. Do you think we're going to be all right, and especially here in Washington, D.C.? And number two, the Washington Post editorial board, of which you're part, joined by a mass of your columnists, has been endorsing national service, although today's editorial was the most weak-kneed, washed-out endorsement I've ever seen. What possibility does national service have of helping make things so they're going to be all right?
So, yes, I think we are going to be all right. I really do. To your question earlier, at the gut level, I have no choice but to be hopeful and to think that we'll be all right. There are things that have happened that make me question that. If you look at what conventional wisdom used to be and used to say, the person who is the Republican nominee for president shouldn't be the Republican nominee for president. And so that's caused me to question a whole lot of assumptions about what should happen or could happen on November 8th. But I do think that ultimately, as we get closer to Election Day and people sort of sober up and pay attention to what's really at stake. I mean, I am not on shaky ground here because I know there is bipartisan support for what I'm about to say, which has been the Washington Post editorial board position from almost minute one, and that is that Donald Trump is a threat to our democracy. And I think my hope is that 50.1% of the American people who actually go out and vote will agree. I just interviewed for my podcast, K-Pop, another plug, iTunes, Google Play, Evan McMullin, who's running for president as an independent candidate. And he is a conservative. There is no question about it. He would be a Republican were it not for Donald Trump. And even he said, flat out, that Donald Trump is a threat to American democracy. He even called him an agent for Vladimir Putin, an unwitting agent. So my hope is, as we get closer, people will sober up. And one of the reasons why we got started late was because I got here late, was because I had to get the latest piece that I wrote out with the headline, Democrats, get your damned big boy pants on. There's so much fretting and bedwetting, which, Democrats are like Olympians when it comes to that. And, forget that, Hillary Clinton is working her butt off. She tried to power through pneumonia, and that didn't work. She's putting out policy papers left and right. People don't like to get into policy papers, but they're there. You can see what she's about. And so if she's working that hard to be elected president of the United States, then Democrats should get their act together, pull it together, and on November 8th, go out and vote. Now, to your other part of your question, which I've been trying to avoid about our editorial about national service, it's a matter of opinion. I think we agree that national service is a good idea. I think one of the issues is whether, how compulsory should it be? Weighing the pros and the cons of it. This was I'm trying not to, this is like I've been given a national security briefing and I'm trying to figure out what I can and can't tell you. There's only so much I can tell you from inside the room. But just know that there were very strong discussions on both sides of the issue about compulsory, not compulsory, the impact that would have on innovation and creativity if you took people out of the workplace to do national service. There's a lot of conversation, and so maybe that's why what you read from your perspective. I haven't heard anyone else's perspective, that it was did you say milk toast, wheat knead, what was it?
Yeah, but all of it. I just want to say one little more thing. I don't think any of all those op-ed people on your, who write for the Post have ever suggested that it be compulsory. Where is this artificial notion of it being compulsory coming from? Nobody says we're going to reinstate the draft. What about supporting national service, period? I mean, a Peace Corps volunteer costs $30,000 a year, $1 million for every soldier.
Mm-hmm.
The total budget for Peace Corps in America, AmeriCorps wouldn't pay for the DC Fire Department or the school system. It's nothing. It's chicken feed, and if you could quadruple them all, and it wouldn't even be a dot in the budget.
You want my seat on the board? Do you have another question? You have a question? You really do have a question? Okay. No, I am. Yes, you. Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Jeff, going back one step, in the interest of being all right, I wondered if you could discuss a little more about what your opinion is of the value of arts activism. Given what happened, let's say, with Yossi Sargent and Van Jones, and you look at relative backlash that comes from all manner of arts activism. I think of Bruce Springsteen, for instance, being incredibly strong and also being incredibly shouted at the same time. And there's quite often a voice that says, come on, artist, just do what you do. That's what you do. So do you analyze that in your own work to some extent and say, this is when it's valuable, this is when it isn't valuable, and what the parts and pieces are that go into that?
Well, I mean, number one, it's got to be great art, period, right? Otherwise, nobody's going to be paying attention at all. So I think that that's central to everything. And then we can have the discussion, right? But I absolutely feel like the arts is the place to be having the discussions that the mainstream is not necessarily having at that particular point. So if things are too loud, it's maybe time to turn it down. Let's look at the artists. If things are too quiet or not enough attention's being paid to something, like maybe it's time to turn it up. Let's turn to the artists to hear about that as well.
I mean, I think that the value of it has been shown historically over time.
Yeah, for sure.
Yes, we can. But I'm also mindful of that. I mean, one of the things we do in my Aspen Institute program is an arts strategy group, which brings together a lot of people to talk who ordinarily don't talk. And I've heard quite clearly from people on the Republican side of the aisle that they feel alienated because the arts are always against them, that they don't feel like they have a stake in it, and that leads to a lot of what we see in terms of the backing and the backlash, I think. But I'm not sure how to get past that. It just seems to be how it lines up.
Yeah, I don't know either. What I will say is this, is that if we don't actually have a national cultural policy, that everything is going to be left to the marketplace and to the good graces of wealthy people. And I think that that's the situation that we're in now. I mean, New Zealand spends 60 times per capita what the U.S. spends on culture and the arts. And I think that it ends up showing then, and every time anybody wants to complain about the kind of popular culture that we have, we should ask the question, who funds the art that nobody expects to make money off of, right? So.
And final question.
I just wanted to take you back to your conversation, your confrontational conversation. And just imagine that you were a Japanese American and the person you were talking to was a Korean American. What kinds of things would have been said? What kinds of things would have been left unsaid, bearing in mind the complicated political, geopolitical, cultural problems between Koreans and Japan?
Well, the conversation that we were having was about Lowell High School, and I think that it could have been a conversation about UC Berkeley, the University of California system, and I think that the questions become different when we're talking about Asian American questions. That in that respect, we're talking about resources. We're talking about identities that are, rooted in what's happening right at this particular point in time. So, I've had this kind of conversation with all kinds of Asian Americans. It's a conversation that happens. It just happens that in San Francisco, Chinese Americans have been the primary organizers of anti-affirmative work. If you look nationally at Asian American statistics, something over 2/3, over 2 in 3 of every Asian American is a strong supporter of affirmative action. And so the organizers of these types of movements are often very small immigrant groups that are funded by legal foundations that are outside of the community. And I think that that's one of the realities that's happening now for Asian Americans, is that despite the fact that all polls show that Asian Americans lean pretty liberal, that there's a perception in the media that it's up for grabs. And that's actually not the case at all. All of the data show that Asian Americans, first generation, second generation, third generation, fourth, fifth, or sixth like mine, tend to lean very liberal on questions of racial equity and justice.
Jeff Chang, Executive Director of the Institute for Diversity in the Arts at Stanford University, author of We Gon Be Alright.
Thank you so much.